I'm Aaron. I'm a junior currently debating for Thomas Wootton High School.
Hi, I'm Tristan. I'm a sophomore and I debate at the Potomac School.
All right, starting with the resolution and definition. So, the January topic resolution is resolved. The African Union should grant diplomatic recognition to the Republic of Somaliland as an independent state. As for the process of how this would pass or work within the African Union, is that recognition requires a two-thirds majority vote in the African Union in order to come into effect. Um, in terms of like why this sort of matters, I guess, is for definitions. There is an argument like to recognition that, in general, it is accepted that the context of the resolution is the African Union would recognize Somalia as an independent state, as sort of implied by the resolution. However, there are certain teams that define diplomatic resolution recognition, as forming diplomatic relations with the AU and not necessarily causing it to become independent or causing it to be recognized as a country of its own. And there is a T shell or T sort of independent voter argument that has been made off this. But in general, and what most of the literature tends to like support, or most of the ground is formed off of, is the idea that the African Union doing the AF would then result in Somaliland being recognized as its own country, independent of Somalia, so as an independent state. Um, More on the actor, the African Union is a regional body in Africa consisting of 55 member states, and it's existed for a little more than 2 decades at this point.
Hi, background information. So, Somaliland broke ties with Somalia's government after declaring independence in 1991 after only being together for a couple of days, and since then has sought international recognition as an independent state. It is right now technically still a part of Somalia, located in the larger Horn of Africa region. It has hundreds of miles of coastline along the Gulf of Aden, which is significant for some of the arguments that we will talk about later. So, the Somaliland government asserts that it meets the requirements of a state, and that is its main claim towards why it deserves recognition. They claim that they hold fair and free democratic elections, has its own currency and security forces, and they issue their own passports, all of which are true and should qualify it to be a state. It has a gross domestic product or GDP of 2 billion, which is one of the lowest in the world, but it's still higher than Somalia's. Somalia, as we'll talk about later, is very opposed to Somaliland's independence. And as of now, no country has actually recognized Somaliland besides Taiwan, but Taiwan right now is not a country.
Moving on to recent events and like developments. So first is the Memorandum of Understanding, or the MOU, which is actually what most literature and evidence on this topic is based on. So a lot of the more recent articles and like papers, etc., is in the context of the MOU because it is very uh, similar to sort of the AF situation or the AF policy. And it was an agreement, or sort of an yeah, it was an agreement between Ethiopia and Somaliland that essentially was premised on Ethiopia would have recognized Somaliland in exchange for Somaliland leasing land to Ethiopia to build a naval facility on its coast. So a couple things to take note of is that first, it was driven by Ethiopia's desire for access to the sea because it's landlocked and thus really wants to access like a naval facility or sort of a training post on a coast in order to expand itself. And that's sort of like an existential issue for Ethiopia, which could be related to other arguments we'll talk about a little more later. But second is that the reason why this is like sort of important to understand, and the reason why so much evidence is based on this, is that Ethiopia would have recognized Somaliland, which is a very similar action sort of to the African Union doing so. So that's why so much literature is like sort of based around this. And then you can cross apply this to use in terms of mostly neg preparation. And that's because that what ended up happening from the MOU was that it stoked high tensions across the region, with Somalia even threatening to invade or launch a war against Ethiopia. There are a lot of public statements being made that they were ready to go to war against Ethiopia as a result of this. And an interesting note to make is that the AU actually backed up Somalia here, which demonstrates that in the status quo, the plan or the resolution is pretty unpopular, which brings to a lot of questions like, well, what does that actually look like, or how would the affirmative actually materialize if the AU right now is like opposed?
So, as a result of the MOU, which is kind of something that happened in like January, Turkish mediation has now kind of mediated tensions within the region, which has been a pretty recent event happening like December. essentially, Turkey mediated an agreement between Somalia and Ethiopia. In this agreement, Somalia has agreed to give Ethiopia access to the sea, and presumably, this means that Ethiopia will back down from the MOU. The final agreement is set to be completed in February, but there is a lot of literature out there about how this agreement might not come into fruition and might not be successful. For example, this is because of the fact that there have been skirmishes between Ethiopia and Somalia in certain parts of the regions, and that there's still other issues that could hamper negotiations. For example, if Ethiopia doesn't think that Somalia's provision of access to the sea is sufficient for them, they might still decide that Somaliland is a better option and might recognize Somaliland.
Okay, now discussing the affirmative. So we'll be going over a couple of arguments on the off, and then we'll switch over to the neg. And as you'll see, the way we're going to do this is just laying out the unitas link, internal link, and impact for an example contention, or what we saw was mostly the structure of these sort of arguments, and then going over a few notes on what we think about them. So the first argument we'll touch on is economic development as an AF. And there's the unitas generally centers around the idea that Somalia's economy right now is underdeveloped. It lacks connection to international markets, trade, investment, etc. And as a result, it has poor living conditions and high poverty. And that leads us to the link, which is that recognition would open up the possibility for investment, specifically FDI or foreign direct investment, in addition to things like aid from foreign countries, loans from the IMF and World Bank, which right now are not possible because Somaliland is not recognized as an independent country, so cannot access those, and also trade with other countries. In addition to the likelihood of more commercial deals, for example, regarding the port of Berbera, which we touched upon that Somaliland's unique geography offers it a very strategic location in terms of both economic potential and other potential we'll touch on more. But in general, you can see that there's a plethora of different link arguments you can make. And the general narrative is that recognition would, in general, just boost the potential for economic development and potential for economic growth in Somaliland. These are some of the more stock ones. There are more nuanced ones. For example, one that was interesting is the idea that right now Somaliland is shackled to sanctions that are placed on Somalia because they are sort of internationally one country, which is why recognizing Somaliland as its independent nation would then alleviate those sanctions, which could potentially take away those negative economic harms. In terms of the internal link, so any one of these links and all of these links can together, they all really just connect back to this idea and this narrative of economic growth within Somaliland, which you can also make spillover arguments to across the region or to neighboring countries, and the impact of this for more lay-friendly ones, and also in general, the more true ones is just alleviating poverty, conditions, living conditions like health, etc. And then also in terms of more technical perspectives, you can read that like economic growth is an impact filter, for example, regional stability and terror recruiting. So recruiting for terrorism, those are all things that economic growth or economic development can play a role in. As for the notes, this is probably the most stock affirmative argument, and it's also very lay friendly because it's very straightforward and also very compelling and I guess like believable in comparison to some of the other arguments that might be made on this topic. But it is susceptible on a more technical level to internal link turns, for example, or just in general link turns, for example, like FDI bad or aid bad. So definitely like prep and be ready to have those debates. And a good way to avoid those is like making your links more nuanced.
Right. So this next argument is about piracy, and it's my personal favorite argument. The uniqueness says that Somalia piracy, which was high in 2011, is now resurging, and subsequently, or separate of that, the global economy is now also on the brink, which is why increases in piracy hurting trade would push us over the brink and cause global economic decline. There are a couple of links on this argument which make it a very hard argument to answer. The first link is that recognition would enable cooperation with other countries, for example, other countries in Africa or France or Europe, that can lead to crackdowns on Somali piracy via, for example, cooperation between navies. The second link is that recognition can lead to economic growth, which counters the root cause of piracy in the region, which is poverty. The third link is that recognition would encourage other regions to combat piracy as well. To the right of Somaliland is another region called Puntland, which, similar to Somaliland, is seeking recognition from countries worldwide. If Puntland sees that Somaliland was able to improve piracy and that could have been a factor leading to its recognition, they will also be encouraged to also build up their anti-piracy efforts. The internal link is that piracy decks the global economy. The evidence on this is very good. It says that due to the fact that there's piracy in the Gulf of Aden, which Somaliland borders, it's causing massive increase in trade costs in the region and deterring trade as a whole. It means that there's increases in amounts in fuel because the ships are trying to go faster to, get around the pirates. It's causing rerouting, which takes more time. And if they don't reroute, they have to pay larger insurance to insurance companies because there is a huge risk of traveling with near pirates or pay huge ransom to these pirates in the first place, all of which are reasons why trade is decreasing as a result. The impact is just that economic decline causes extinction, which is a fairly stock tech impact. A couple of notes for this argument. First, it's a pretty popular argument, so you need to make sure that you have responses to the common arguments made against this. Some of the common arguments made are impact defense, saying that economic decline doesn't cause extinction, or maybe just impact turns that says that it actually leads to peace, or uniqueness defense that says that piracy is decreasing now and that trade as a whole is resilient.
Okay, the next argument is resources. So the uniqueness level is that Somaliland has large REMs or rare earth minerals slash metals deposits, and it also has some other resources, for example, like oil. Real quick, touching on oil. So this argument doesn't generally center around oil, but I do want to include it in here more so just as a general topic knowledge sort of thing. The only argument I really saw touch upon this was actually a neg argument or dissad about fracking. So it's just good to know that that is potential thing that regards the resource argument in general. But moving more onto the general idea of resources on the app, which is mostly centered around rare earth minerals or metals. The second piece you need is that you generally want to read is that the world or other countries right now need certain resources available in Somaliland, particularly like these REMs. So the link level is just that recognition would open up the possibility for investment into resource extraction. So you basically are co-opting the econ development links and the econ growth links, and they're very similar here, but you're specifying them into the area of resource extraction uniquely, and also like contextualizing them in terms of commercial projects or infrastructure development in Somaliland, which is key to being able to leverage these resources like REMs. So the internal link level, since the link level is similar to an econ link, you can also read an econ growth internal link or impact sort of those things. But more importantly, like for REM specifically, you can read that REMs are key to solving climate change as they're used across green and clean tech development. So being able to leverage the Somaliland deposits of REMs would be crucial in the fight against warming. And for the impact, it's just any standard climate change impact. You can have localized impacts or the general existential impact that climate change causes extinction. Um, for the notes of this argument, first, it is kind of unique. So this works both ways. Not a lot of people have like read or I guess like cut a lot of cards in this, but that also cuts both ways because there generally isn't that much literature in terms of actual specific link literature on this argument. So if you're able to find that, that's definitely good because you really want to contextualize like the scenario and specificity instead of just trying to get like any blippy link into climate change. And the only other note we have is that it is pretty susceptible to things like link turns. So we touch upon with oil and fracking, but also the idea that mining or resource extraction, dependency slash exploitation in general is bad, opening Somaliland up to like foreign companies, etc.
Okay, so this next argument is about democracy. The uniqueness is that African democracy is declining now and needs a model. This uniqueness evidence is pretty good, and the idea of African democracy declining now is pretty true, so you shouldn't have a problem winning this uniqueness. There are two links into the argument. The first is that Somaliland is a very strong democracy that can serve as a model in the region, and as such, recognition would signal that the AU values democracy in the region, which causes regional follow on. The second link is that Somaliland's democracy is seen as synonymous with poverty because, like we said above, they are one of the poorest countries in the world, which is leading to countries not adopting their specific democratic governance model, which is why improving the economy could lead to adoption across Africa. These two pieces of link evidence are kind of sketch, but I think that these are arguments that you can make out of them, so it should be sufficient enough. The internal link is that Africa is critical, sorry, not to the global economy, but to global democracy as a whole, because its young people do things that combat authoritarianism. And the impact is that democracy caps existential risks, i.e., democracies do research into things like climate change and diseases that authoritarian governments don't. A couple of notes for this argument. The first is that this is a pretty unique argument and wasn't read a lot at Blake, and there's not much literature that actually responds to the link level of the argument. That's why the most common response to this argument that was read by a lot of teams was just democracy impact turns, saying that democracy is actually bad. So you need to make sure that you have responses to these as well.
Okay, the next argument is sort of a broader category of arguments, not necessarily a specific scenario, but it's follow-on. So union this level, individual countries and foreign powers are not recognizing Somaliland right now. And the warranty that's typically read is that they don't want to be the first to do so. Specifically, for example, they want Africa to sort of jurisdict over those issues and a credible regional body take the lead, which is why the link is that AU recognition or African Union recognition has the legitimacy and the sort of um, influence to be the first to do so, which allows other countries to be more willing to follow on once the AU has taken the decisive move and done so, setting like sort of the precedent. And for the internal links, so this is where it's sort of more of a category of arguments. It's really just you have to find individual countries recognizing, which then leads to specific scenarios or specific benefits. For example, there's a lot of literature on the US, and there's some literature on India, Australia, and Israel. So definitely looking into those. Scenarios could be very unique scenarios or unique countries based off those arguments. And that would also lead to individual impacts because the impacts would be reliant on scenario specific countries such as like the US causing specific impacts. And we have an example in the next slide specifically for the US as to what one potential follow-on scenario would look like. Notes for this argument, you definitely want to prep for thumpers, especially recently. There's been a lot of news going around about President Trump, who just won the election, planning on recognizing Somaliland. So definitely prep against those thumpers because those could take out the arguments like these. And the only other note is that it is a bit more lengthy of a link chain than other arguments because now you not only have to win an idea that recognition would be good, you now have to win that recognition from the AU would then lead to recognition from another body or another country, and then that recognition would be good as well. For the example of a follow-on affirmative is hedge or is like U.S. hedge or a China argument. So you need this level. It's the idea that the U.S. is losing hegemony or influence across Africa right now, and for example, simultaneously, China is gaining hegemony or influence in Africa, and that's why the U.S. needs to follow on after AU recognition, which is the link. So the same thing as a follow-on, those sort of warrants about why the AU could just needs to be the first one in order to set precedent or compel other countries to do so apply here in terms of the United States. So the US will only follow on after AU recognition, which is why the app is a good idea because in the internal link level is that the US doing the, recognition of Somaliland could be good. For example, for sending a signal of engagement in Africa to regain influence. And you can also cross-apply some of the warrants that we discussed in other arguments. For example, for economic development, economic engagement in developing countries in Africa, from the econ arguments, or just like the democracy promotion arguments that we touched upon. Those are all examples of why engagement could be seen positively. But more importantly and more specifically is the commercial and military deals, for example, military basing in Somaliland, which are once again important because of its geographically strategic location, which can all be influential in sort of US influence and hedge in the broader African region. Impact wise, it's generally just any hedge good. Or if you're reading China, any China expansion bad impact. For example, transition wars causing extinction as like hegemonic transition wars, or authoritarianism that's like spread from arguments being made about like Chinese expansion spreading authoritarianism. Notes for this argument, same through democracy. You definitely want to watch out for impact turns. There's definitely good backfile, backfile literature on hedge bad, etc. And it has the same worries as follow on about thumpers, specifically for this argument because it centers the US. You definitely want to look into thumpers because that is definitely like one of the main responses that people are going to go for, insofar as a lot of literature and a lot of evidence has been published about the US planning on doing so already.
All right, so this next argument about regional stability is a very strategic argument. The uniqueness is that new deals are said to be formed by Somaliland and other governments that are like the MOU, which will cause tensions and instability in the region. The reason why it inflames tensions it is because it is sort of acting as a state despite not being one. So it is doing these things that are kind of like illegal. The second piece of uniqueness is that Turkish mediation will fail within the region, which is why the MOU will be revitalized and tensions in the region will remain, if not spill over and evolve into war. There are two links for this argument, both of which kind of rely on each other. The first is that recognizing Somaliland would legitimize their actions and allows them to do it in the first place. So Somalia can't really backlash against Somaliland doing things like these trade deals because now they are fully allowed to do so. The second link is that the African Union will compel Somalia to negotiate and foster regional diplomacy as a whole. So, even if that there are new deals that are formed in the future, or even if Somalia doesn't actually like the affirmative, the African Union can compel them to negotiate and agree to it, which solves for a lot of the neg harms that I'll talk about in a little. The impact is a pretty common impact on this topic, so it won't be contested like hegemony or democracy, and it's just that regional conflict slash instability would draw in great powers into the region due to their vested interests and resources in the region, causing great power war due to tensions and miscalculation between them, causing extinction. A couple of notes for this argument. First, this was a very common argument at Blake, so you should have frontlines prepared for it. And the second is that, again, this argument is very, very strategic. The link about compelling Somalia to negotiate can solve for like a lot of DAs. For example, invasion. They won't invade if the African Union is compelling them to negotiate, and there's no decrease in cohesion if they agree after diplomacy happens by the African Union. And the uniqueness. For example, the fact that there are new deals emerging can actually also non-unique a lot of disads. For example, if there are new deals like the MOU said to happen, it means things like invasion are probably inevitable. This next argument is more of a lay argument and it's about food aid. The uniqueness is that climate change is causing a food crisis in Somaliland now, which is why millions of people in Somaliland face food insecurity. The link is that recognition that because recognition prevents food aid from going to Somaliland, the affirmative would solve by recognizing them and allowing food aid to actually go to Somaliland. The second link is more nuanced and is one that I would probably not recommend reading on delay because it is a little bit confusing. The link is that Somaliland joining the AU can help bring a better framework for climate adaptation, which would help mitigate the effect of climate change on Africa and food as a whole, decreasing food insecurity. The evidence on this is good, it's just hard to persuade a lay that this argument is necessarily true. The impact is just that 1.7 million people faced food insecurity within Somaliland with a high risk of death. For the notes on this argument, it's pretty simple. It is a lay argument and pretty stock. However, you should watch out for some internal link turns to this argument. For example, there is a lot of literature out there that says food aid is bad, so you should be prepared to respond to those.
Okay, moving on to negation or the negative arguments or disads. So the first one is invasion uniqueness level. So a common theme you'll see across the neg is we'll touch upon the impacts, but generally they rely on the same internal link impact scenarios and sort of similar uniqueness pictures that you're trying to paint. So for invasion, the general idea of uniqueness here is that tensions are down. There's not a high chance of war in the status quo, which is why we should preserve it. A couple of reasons for this. For example, the Turkish mediation we touched upon has reduced tensions in the region, or in general, there just isn't a chance of war breaking out right now due to different reasons. But the link is that recognizing Somaliland would unfortunately cause Somalia to invade Somaliland because they see it as an accidental threat to their sovereignty if Somalia were to become its own independent nation. And um, sort of that argument is proven in, there's like some link evidence being made specifically drawing on the idea that they want to preserve their sovereignty, and we'll touch upon why you want to more focus on the capacity, but there definitely is a lot of incentive, strong analysis on incentive that you can do. So impact wise, really you can just draw on any standard regional conflict spills over / instability causes great power drawing because of their vested interest in the region. So this is the common theme impact that you'll see. General instability across Africa, which then causes, for example, great power war and thus extinction. For more lay-friendly arguments, you could do conflict would kill hundreds of thousands, or just any standard conflict impact that isn't necessarily existential. The notes for this argument, as you can see, it's very straightforward. It's only really one link, and it's very top sort of concise argument, which is why it works both good on the lay and the tech. It's also pretty stock, so be prepared to respond to things. For example, as I was touching on a little earlier, the idea that uh, there is good incentive analysis, but a lot of teams, and I know Tristan has also done a lot of research on this, have questions, for example, Somalia's actual capacity to carry out an invasion. So if you are planning on reading this argument, you definitely want to do some research and work there. The second note we have is that the weighing for this argument and the weighing for most neg arguments in this sides in general is pretty good, because in general, their instability, war impacts, or in this case, invasion, all mean that the affirmative probably can't solve for a majority of its arguments. For example, in the event of a war, there would not be an influx of investment or incentives for investment to flow in, and there would not be the potential for infrastructure to be allowed to develop up, which is why, in general, weighing wise, it's a lot harder to be AF on this topic. But definitely not that big of a skew.
This second argument is pretty stock and it's about terror. The evidence on this argument is very, very good. The A couple of extra background information is probably necessary for this argument though. As a result of the MOU that was established between Ethiopia and Somaliland, Somalia backlashed against Ethiopia and told Ethiopia that it needed to withdraw all around 5,000 of its troops from the region. But as a result of Turkish mediation in the region now, it has improved Somalia-Ethiopia relations, and now Somalia is allowing Ethiopian troops to stay in the region. So this is a part of the uniqueness picture. The second part is that Al-Shabaab is down now due to regional security cooperation. The link on this argument is very good and has been historically proven that recognition causes Somalia to backlash against, like in this case, the African Union and Ethiopia because they are both recognizing Somaliland, and subsequently they will kick out African Union and Ethiopian troops. This link, again, is historically proven by the MOU because remember, they threatened to, or they basically kicked out Ethiopian troops from the region as a result until they agreed to not do recognition. The internal link for this argument is that African Union and Ethiopian troops are critical to fighting Al Shabaab in the region, which is why historically we have seen that when there was tensions in the region as a result of the MOU, Al Shabaab, which is the terrorist group in the region, was able to gain more and more ground. But now that they're kind of like locked in again, Al Shabaab is decreasing in power. The impact is kind of the same as the other ones above, which is that regional conflict and instability draws in great powers, causes great power war and extinction. An impact on the lay that is kind of hard to find is that Al Shabaab kills a lot of people. Okay, so notes. Like Aaron said above, the weighing off of arguments like this, just instability, DAs in general, are very, very good because it often means that the affirmative cannot solve for the arguments that they actually describe. Specifically for this argument, though, it is more of a tech argument because, again, it is hard to find a decent lay impact for this, so I just recommend reading it on tech judges.
Okay, the next argument is civil war. So the neediness for this is similar to the ones we touched upon. Just a picture that the idea that right now the status quo is peaceful or de-escalatory, and specifically for this argument that tensions and civil unrest in Somaliland have de-escalated. So to understand this argument more as like a big picture, the general structure and like base premise of Somaliland's structure is like clan-based politics. So it's based off of, I think, around 5 different clans. And The argument generally is based on the idea that most of these clans actually do not support secession or Somaliland becoming independent, and instead are more unionist and pro being a part of one Somalia or just a part of Somalia instead of like an independent state. Which is why the two links here are, for example, that recognition would cause aid to go to the Isaac clan, which is the clan that's currently in charge, and thus why many like probably that could be a good explanation as to why a lot of literature on this topic is like, well, Somaliland itself wants to be independent, but more so that's just the Isaac clan, since that's the one actually in control of like the government or governing body of Somaliland, which is why it seems to be more secessionist. But you can make the argument that in general these other clans are actually opposed, and the link here is that recognition would cause aid to go to the Isaac clan, which causes these other clans to go to war in fear that the Isaac clan will have the capability to wipe them out. But more in general, it could just cause a lot of disagreement or distrust or just unrest within these other clans if the international community were to adhere to just one clan's sort of request for independence. The second link is that recognition would cause aid to that primarily goes to like big corporations, or just a sort of aid bad argument that causes mass inequality that just drives unrest. So this link is less reliant on the clan-based structure of Somaliland and more so just an aid bad turn or an aid bad link hidden within this argument, but definitely does fit well into the general narrative of civil unrest or causes of civil war. Impact wise, mostly the same impact, just reading regional spillover instability arguments that then cause, once again, the great power draw-in and thus leading to massive amounts of spillover in wars. For more flay arguments, there definitely is a little bit better evidence here about how regional instability, or specifically like civil unrest within Somaliland, would kill thousands and displace millions. For notes, wouldn't recommend reading this in its entirety on the lay because it is a bit more complicated and a bit more historical context dependent. But I think if you shorten it or focus more on the main narrative of it, it definitely can work well, especially because it's very specific and nuanced and thus might seem more compelling and unique to a lay judge or a flay in general. It's also a great tech argument. And once again, all of the weighing that we've talked about definitely do apply here as well.
Right. So this next argument is about African Union cohesion. The uniqueness is that right now the African Union is locked in on economic reforms to boost Africa's economy as a whole. There are a couple of links into this argument. The first is about secession and how, if the affirmative spurred secessionist movements, or even the fear of it spurring secessionist movements, would distract the African Union. This link is kind of more general, and you can kind of say that any argument about causing instability in the region would distract the African Union. So this could act also as an impact for other instability arguments. The second link, which I think is the most like true and best piece of link evidence, is that recognition would cause divisions within the African Union, whereas some sides would support Somalia. For example, they have support from Egypt, and others would support Somaliland, for example, Ethiopia, which would decrease cohesion in the African Union as a whole, as some countries support one side, some support another, and it just decreases focus on economic reforms too as a whole. The internal link is that the global economy is slowing, which is why Africa, with its young consumer market and like things revolving around investment, is critical to revitalizing the global economy that is on the brink now. And the impact is just that economic decline would cause extinction. In terms of notes, this is a pretty unique tech argument, and not many teams have good responses to it. So it's one I'd highly recommend that you read.
Okay, moving on to a more stock argument. This is the secession DA. So the idea is that right now, secession across the Africa region or the Africa continent is down in the status quo. Or I guess you could also make the argument that secession in general is down. The idea is really just you want to focus on secession movements not really succeeding or being prevalent in the status quo. But the link is that recognizing Somaliland would cause these other secessionist movements or other countries in the region to then pursue their own recognition, or it's a sort of emboldenment and empowerment idea that causes a spillover effect of secession in the general region or general area because of Somaliland gaining its own independence. So the impact of this, the same instability, sort of regional conflict, war impacts that we've touched upon over and over again, really just apply here as well. A more nuanced and specific way you can go about this is looking at a few or one or two specific secessionist movements and then drawing on arguments or impacts from those. And more that's kind of what delayed impact is as well, or just drawing on history that shows that secessionist movements or secessionist wars have historically led to millions of deaths in Africa. For notes, this works well as both a lay and a tech argument, but it's probably the most stock argument on the neg and thus prepped out by most people. It is still winnable though. It's just important to have a lot of work and preparation done. For example, frontlining common arguments against this, such as Somaliland having very unique conditions, or even setting the bar higher for secession insofar as Somaliland is a very democratic nation and has unique conditions, which we touched upon, and more of the affirmative arguments. So definitely want to have some preparation against those arguments.
So this final argument is about piracy. The uniqueness is that recent bumps in piracy will stay limited due to things like governments cooperating. The first link is that affirming would deck Somaliland's incentive to counter piracy because they now have recognition. This is essentially arguing that the only reason why Somaliland feels the need to counter piracy now is for recognition, and the affirmative would take that incentive away. The second link is kind of again touching about how the affirmative would be an unequal distribution of aid and not actually help the economy whatsoever, which means people would then decide to become pirates because they perceive that as the only viable economic opportunity for this. The link evidence for both of these are kind of questionable, but they are both arguments that you definitely can make. The internal link is that piracy would deck the global economy, and the impact is just that economic decline caused extinction. As a couple of notes, the first is that you don't really have to read this in specific internal link and impact. There are other impacts that people read. For example, some people said that militarization by great powers against piracy would cause regional tensions and great power wars. Overall, though, I wouldn't suggest you to read this argument as a DA in case. Rather, I would just suggest you reading it again. If the affirmative reads the piracy argument, you should read this against it as a turn to their argument.
Okay, thank you for watching, and make sure to check out Circuit Skill Builder for more resources like this.